Welcome to the first episode of Minds Behind Maps. I'm Maxim Lernermund, and this is the first episode in this experiment I'm trying out, where I want to sit down with people who are creating and using anything geospatial to try to understand more about the field and the people in it. My first victim in this endeavor is Ian Schuler, the CEO of Development Seed, a company I've been curious about for quite some time now, as I saw how much they contribute to open source projects and just how generally open they seem. They've been working with partners like the Washington Post, of which we talked about in length in this episode, as well as the World Bank, UNICEF, and the American Red Cross, and many other organizations. Ian talks about the challenges they're trying to solve, how open source is a part of the answer to some of those problems, as well as what he thinks about the current state of the industry. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did, and hopefully as much as Ian did talking with me. Either way, I'd be really happy to know what you think about this. Feel free to reach out on Twitter. This is where I'm most active. I'm at Max Lernermund. And while you're at it, Ian Schuler and Development Seed might be worth a follow if you ask me. In the meantime, here's my conversation with Ian Schuler. So, can you start by telling me who you are and how you would describe yourself?
Sure. So I'm Ian Schuler. I'm the CEO of Development Seed. And how I would describe myself, I mean, I get that's an feels like a loaded question. Yeah, I mean, so to the extent that I'm the head of Development Seed, what I do here is I take a bunch of really impressive, smart people who are great at building things, and I find a bunch of really hard, interesting problems out there, and I try to match those two things together. And if I'm doing my job well, I am empowering a group of people who I am constantly impressed by to do some of the best work of their lives for another group of people that I'm constantly impressed by who are solving really hard problems around the world. And yeah, when that works, it's a really beautiful thing. And so, who am I? Yeah, I think what I bring to this that hopefully makes me good at this role is being able to really dig in on problems. I like to make connections that maybe people haven't seen previously. I like to sort of figure out how to game the system, where finding ways to bend the assumptions and rules in ways that get you to a point that is really something new and special, right? And I think first you have to understand the rules, but then you also have to know how to manipulate them, right? So all of the best artists in the world did this. They understood the rules of perspective and painting and all that. Then they broke them, and they didn't just break them in random ways. They broke them in very thoughtful ways that created a new way of looking at a problem. And that's when I'm at my best and when we're at our best, that's the sort of work that we're doing, and what I really get the most joy out of.
Do you have an example of one of those cases where you feel like you need to bend the rules to get somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, geez, all the time, right? On things as mundane as how do you create a business model around what we're
Mm-hmm.
doing? I think one of the things that is unique about Development Seed is how much we contribute to open source, and how much we try to take what we've learned um, and make that available to other people, right? I think that's not the natural reaction for a lot of the other peer groups. There are plenty of other groups that work this way as well, right? And I don't want to I don't want to make it seem like we've come up with something that we're the only ones that do this, or the first ones that do this. But then figuring out how to then take that desire to want to put knowledge out into the world, not open data, open code, but still be able to use that as a way of not just being a nice to thing to do on the side, but actually a thing that drives our core way of working, core business. And we've found, I think, that actually, to the converse, the open source work that we're putting out there and the tools we're building, because we're building things that are useful and usable, and actually doing it um, in a kind of in a manner that is trying to make things easier for ourselves, but make things easier for other people. That ends up like actually leading to more work and opportunities. It's not just at all. It is altruistic, but it actually ends up being a thing that is so important to how we work. Right? It brings in new opportunities. It allows us to capture work without having to do a ton of business development like other organizations are investing in. It allows that work to already be highly aligned with us, right? Because the people who see the things that we're building and say, yeah, I need that, and I need more of it, I need to do this thing for me. Those people are already coming from a similar worldview. They have problems that are very well matched, the sorts of things that we can solve. And they tend to want to be co-collaborators, right? They're not just hiring you to create X widget for them. They're hiring you to figure out how this thing that you're building can help them solve this problem, that it's so close, it's almost there, but it needs, like, how can we repurpose it for that goal, which is great. And it also allows us to be constantly sort of surfing the edge of what's possible. And so when you're a services firm, you either end up on that side of things where you're surfing the edge of what's possible, and people hire you because you bring an insight or value that they can't easily find anywhere else because it hasn't been commodified yet. Or you're the commodifier, right? Where you figured out how to lock this down and squeeze value out of it. So you have built this widget 100 times and you can build it faster, better, more efficient than anybody else. But on that side of things, in a rapidly moving environment like tech and geospatial tech in particular, there's a lot of risk of somebody inventing a platform that basically does that for you, right? If we were still doing basically, data visualization on top of maps at the level that we were 7 years ago, we wouldn't really be in business anymore, right? Because there's so many ways there's so many tools that have popped up that have made it easier to do that. And that's great. And it's a good thing that that's happening. But I think like our open source work has actually been important in allowing us pushing us to grow and evolve, and putting us on one of those ride the crest of the wave paths, rather than a lock down your competitive advantage and squeeze every nut out of it.
So why is open source the way to go if there's these like two approaches that you say?
I don't know that it necessarily is the way to go for everything or everyone. I think it's worked really well for us. I think Joe Morrison has a number of blog posts that are worth reading about the different sorts of approaches to open source and how you can make it work. I think that my takeaway from that is that there aren't really great roadmaps for how to do this. And I think for certain sorts of tech and certain sorts of work, it has even worked better than others. And I think, the trick is always figuring out how can you create a thing, make it open, and still convince people that they should be paying you money to do things, such that you can continue to pay people and hire them and all that. That's the trick. And so there are a couple different models of doing that. Again, Joe lays some of them out pretty well. But I don't know that it's necessarily the best model for every single thing. I think we come at it more from a different angle, where Development Seed is first and foremost organization that is impact driven. Like, we are trying to make it easier for people to access the data that they need to make good decisions, right? And we've come down this path of working in geospatial because geospatial data and Earth data is the area where there's the biggest gap between the potential value of this data and the application of this data to solve real problems. And that gap exists because it's hard to work with. And so we want to build tools that make it easier for anybody, for more people to be getting more value out of that data and making better decisions in the interests of our planet and the people who live here. So with that as our goal, then open source makes sense. And then it's the trick of how do you then figure out how you work in a way that allow you to make those sorts of contributions. And so we're coming at it at a slightly different angle. If your goal is maximize profit for shareholders, then open source may or may not be the uh, the right approach for you, depending on the sector. And it still may be. Even in that case, it still often may be. But again, it really depends on the sector you're working in, the type of problems you're solving, for whom, how you're getting recouping the value of what it is that you're creating, who's paying you for this thing, and what are their incentives. So yeah, but for us, given our interests and goals and worldview, it was kind of more working the equation back the other way.
So I do want to like understand that a little bit better about how you guys make that work. Is it that when you propose to work with an institution or something, you're like laying it ahead of time about like, you guys have this problem, we know how to solve it, and we want to build something that's open, and but that's like what you pay us for. It's like we've solved the problem for you, but it's also solving it for someone else. And then instead of you selling something to a client, it's just like you're selling them something, but it's just open. Is it something
Yeah,
like that, or
that definitely happens, right? And there's some of our clients that actually want that, right? They're hiring us because they know they're not going to have to deal that their incentive. They want something that's open at the end as well. So the work we do, particularly for development organizations like
Mhm.
UNICEF or the World Bank, like they want the end thing to be open. Work with NASA and USGS, like ultimately they want the end tool to be open, and so that's actually a value for them, is they know that they're not going to have to fight us on that, right? That we're aligned on that goal. In a lot of cases, it's actually more just that the group wants a thing, and we're able to get them there much more quickly on top of the open tools that either we've built or that other people have built. And so we're going to give them their solution, but it's going to involve a lot of components that were previously existing openly licensed libraries. And some of those will improve along the way, including some of the things we've built internally as well. We'll add features or we'll add enhancements to make it work for that use case. And so for them, they only really care about solving the problem and having code. And they also care about having code that they can continue to iterate and improve, particularly, and when we're working for a large institution, they want to know that if this, if we're a 40-person shop, right, 45-person shop at the moment, if we disappeared tomorrow, they want to know that they're not locked in, right, and that they're not getting themselves in trouble. So knowing that they're getting tooling that is open, that there are other developers around there, around many of the components, knowing that they can have hire their own engineers, and there isn't a license restriction that prevents them from like getting into the box, is important for them to have the confidence to hire a group like us. So in a lot of cases, it's just that they want the end solution, and that's the quickest, most efficient way to get there. There are certainly cases where we deal with partners that some of what they're doing that they want us to build on is so unique to them or special to them, that either it doesn't make sense to open source it because it's kind of basically glue code that only would work in their world anyway, and nobody else would ever get value out of it, or where they feel like they don't have a level of comfort in open sourcing it, and where we personally don't see a lot of value. And in those cases, we'll build them proprietary code for them, but we'll still, even in those cases, spin out the elements that we think do have wider application, or where we are pulling in some of the other open source tools. One example of this is we built the election maps for the Washington Post. A lot of that involved some pretty deep integration into their existing CMS. They didn't want that to be publicly available code, partly because, largely, honestly, because, well, I don't know the full reasons. I suspect some of it is that just would give a lot of information about how their platform works that could
Mhm.
potentially be used by somebody who wanted to attack their platform. And so they didn't want the core code to be open source. And that was fine, right? Because it was so integrated with their own proprietary, their own internal content management system that didn't make sense. But we were able to spin out two really valuable open source libraries out of that work. One called Dirty Read Projections, which allows you to trick WebGL into thinking that you're using a different geographic projection than WebMercator, because they had they wanted to use Albers projection. So we built that out. We abstracted it in a way that could be useful for others as well. And a GL testing kit was another thing that we did, because we wanted to be able to, before we built a lot of tooling on GL, understand how many of their users were actually going to be able to render that. And then a like headless screenshotter in order to capture, like create pictures and maps that could be fed into their app. Like all those elements were able to be open sourced. And those are the things that were most likely to be useful to somebody else.
And so is that something when you work with the Washington Post, you're like, well, I'm guessing also ahead of time, you don't necessarily know what all the work that is going to be needed. So you can't necessarily always come up and say, hey, we're going to make a library that does this, this, and that. Are you fine with us opening sourcing it? But I'm also guessing that now you've been doing this for a while. If they approach you or you approach them, there's like this expectation that some of the work is going to end up there. I'm guessing this is like something that is part of the conversation. I could also imagine not everybody is open to that.
Yeah, you're right. Like it is, yeah, it ends up being part of the conversation. I mean, one of the things that we enjoy is very good trust relationships with our partners, particularly, you know, by within a few months of delivering on the project, we're at a place with them that we can have more of those conversations. Um, uh, and you know, if there was a really compelling reason why some of this shouldn't be, then we would have listened to them on that. But I think in these cases, it was clear. And this is also, you know, this is a media organization that does a lot of work. They also already had plenty of open history making parts of their work open source where it was possible. So they weren't antagonists. The Washington Post is actually really great on this. But with other partners, yeah, I mean, I think if you're hiring DevSeed, you probably are at least open to the idea of open source. You're probably using some open source tools already, and you understand the value that you're getting from those. You might already be contributing. And I think like some of it is just understanding the incentives of that organization, whether that's prestige, whether that, you know, getting credit, making sure that they're getting credit for the investments that they're making in this area, or whether that's for them. This is an existing open source tool that their system is now reliant on, and so folding back in these features basically makes it easier for them to maintain their own system going forward, because now it's part of core and not a thing that they're going to need to figure out how to reintegrate every time core changes. So you can, I mean, open source sort of makes sense in a lot of ways. And so you can find the ways that it makes sense for that organization and work with them on that. And yeah, groups that you wouldn't even be able to have that conversation with aren't likely to be development seed partners, customers anyway.
And this might, I'm not sure if this makes sense, but I do wonder, like, if you work with someone with the Washington Post, again, to go back to them, who are like a public media, and they need the trust in the people who read them, do you think that's also part of the reason why it makes sense for them to like say, hey, look, this tool that we're using, it's like, you can go check it out yourself? Does that bring some legitimacy?
I think it does. I don't know how much that's the case for the Washington Post in particular, because of what we were doing was essentially publishing data from the AP faster than anybody else and in a more useful way than anybody else. But there are other places that you could see this exact same data. I think they got more of their validation through just, okay, if I go to these other places, I'm going to see the same numbers. But I think that's absolutely true for some of our other partners, particularly around where you're deriving information in some way, and particularly around AI. And I think that this is actually a really important conversation to have. There is groups that we're working with in the humanitarian space that want to do everything from be able to use AI to model crop output and to do better prediction of crop output, to locating all the schools in the world, to assessing disaster risk. And there are a couple of different approaches for doing that. There are certainly a number of companies that are popping up right now that are applying AI to these problems. And I think particularly for NGOs, for big relief organizations, all of these methods have risk of bias and have risk of getting things wrong in a way that that has implications, right? So we just did a bunch of school detection work with UNICEF, where we were able to detect tens of thousands, I don't remember the number offhand, but tens of thousands of new unmapped schools in 8 countries. Um, and which is great. Adding that many schools to the map is really a fantastic thing to do. We know that we likely missed a lot of schools. We were able to capture schools that can be seen from space and have distinguishing characteristics that allow them to be noticed from space, which actually, fortunately, applies to a lot of schools in places where they tend to be built by the same institution, either a development organization or ministry, the national ministry, to the same set of standards, using similar materials and different, like they have similar features around them. So there are a lot of things that make that very possible, but you're probably going to miss small non-traditional schools, things that are essentially a gathering space in an outdoor area. You're going to miss the things that are in urban areas that are just mixed within the urban canopy, if you will. So and the places that you're likely to miss actually are probably schools that represent communities that are already underrepresented in other ways. And that is a thing that we acknowledge as a weakness. And again, and we would invite people to help us make it better, or at least to know that this is a thing that they need to keep into account when they use the models that we've developed. And we also publish the code, right? So we're making the code available so that people could see that. So even if we didn't notice that, somebody else could try it out somewhere and come to that conclusion on their own. When you have closed source proprietary kind of black box VC funded groups that are trying to do disaster, like build models for disaster response, like then you don't have those sorts of incentives to be open about the weaknesses. You don't have any independent way of verifying that, including the organization itself that's paying for it. And so there's a risk that development organizations invest in a set of closed tools that ultimately erode the sort of trust that you're talking about, that they're because people on the ground will see, hey, wait a minute, you missed all of these schools that are serving this group, but you caught all the ones that are serving this group. And then you have a trust problem, a real trust problem, like for real legitimate reasons. And so I do think that there are certain sectors, when we talked about open source being good or bad in some places, open data good and bad in some places, same with open algorithms. And I think in particular for people who are working in the disaster and humanitarian space, they should really think about defaulting to open unless there's a very compelling reason to use something that isn't.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was actually that's one of the things I wanted to touch upon. I was actually really surprised at how much details you guys put out, on that exact same work on the school mapping. You guys you don't just put the data, you put the metrics, what are the challenges and something all of that detail, which is quite surprising. I don't know, maybe I'm just not used to seeing that level of detail, but
I mean, we're hoping somebody who's smarter than us will read it and tell us where we could get it better, right? I think that's part of the point is have the conversation, show your cards and see what comes back from that. And you'd be surprised, right? We've gotten great people through that approach. We've gotten great insights through that approach. We've gotten really good partners through that approach. Because if you surface the problems, other people are probably working through the same thing. No one's problems are that special. And some of those people will feel seen and want to connect back to you and in a way that's beneficial for them and for you.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that's also great, a great way to find people. If someone goes through and say, hey, I made your thing 10% better, or yeah. Hey, there's this thing, why did you guys do that? It's probably a great way to find people as well. So no, go ahead.
Yep. No, I was just gonna say a lot of our team members have come through our open source work or have specifically referenced people, people who they've read their, like, I found out about DevSeed through this open source project, or I found out through this person who is exactly like very open about how they're working and where and the way that they're working. So those it's great, and I think it allows us. It also allows us to more easily attract the right kind of people, right? People who are going to be a good fit here, more easily find us, and that is good for us and for them.
Yeah, that's also what I was going to say. Like as a fellow engineer, it is really interesting to read those stuff. Like I can imagine for a lot of people, it's like beyond the point, but it's probably a great way to find like other people. I do want to come back on this like field of AI and machine learning. So you were saying, yeah, there's these like you make a model and that model is based on the data and the model that you make. So in the case of like those schools that you mapped, did you how did you solve that, if at all? Like you were saying it's important to communicate about, hey, look, we are aware that we're only basically finding the same types of school, like you were saying, the materials, like what's around them, because that's just how our models work right now. So in practice, like if you tell that to another ML engineer, they're like, yeah, I understand that and everything. But if you put that in the hands of someone who might not understand that, how do you make sure that that's something that really gets through? And how what are some possible ways that you guys have tried to solve that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I see kind of two pieces here, right? Like one is for the partner that we're working with, right, where we have an opportunity to work with them, where we're talking to the person who's going to be the end user of this data, it's a little bit easier. Then you can have the conversation up front about the need for high quality data, like training data. In the schoolwork, we took data that they were able to provide from of schools that they were aware of. We have a really great data annotation and mapping team in Peru who was able to clean that data and already kind of produce something that they could see, oh, actually, this is better. Like this probably was, this random dot in the middle of the ocean probably wasn't a school. I don't know why this was here. And so they are able to see that process of the data like getting cleaner, and then you run the model and you get a set of results, and then you change some things and you see that. So you kind of take them along in the process in the way that they have a little bit more of an intuitive understanding about how all this works, even though they're not going to like build it themselves. They understand the dynamics in a way that give them a better appreciation for when you tell them this at the end, they understand that why. The trickier thing is where you are providing information to users that you don't get to talk to and don't get to bring along the process. Like you're publishing something and people are just going to download the thing and use it. And there you have to be a lot more thoughtful and deliberate about how do you communicate about the methodology, how do you communicate, even if you have a methodology doc, few people actually read that. They just are using this as one input into a thing and all that. So there are a couple of tricks. I don't think we have a complete answer to this. There are a couple of tricks that we've done along the way that I think get at a little bit of this. One that comes to mind is we did some work a few years ago with the World Bank on evaluating the progress of electrification in India. And as part of that, we took 20 years of nighttime satellite imagery from the DMSP satellite program to as an input to sort of show how electrification has changed across 600,000 different villages in India over the last 20 years. And we had this data from DMSP, we had these points, and you could intersect the points and get values and plot over time thing. But the data is super messy. And there were things that we did in how we visualized that data in order to help communicate the messiness of it. Like even in how we chose the scale, like the color scale we used, and then how we chose like the kind of blurriness. We had a point for each area. We didn't visualize these as points. We visualize them more as coverages because the DMSB data was gathering everything over I think it was a kilometer square area. So
Yeah.
you could have misinterpreted this to say this is the value at this point, but that's not actually the case at all. It's really a point within an area that we were pulling from. So we made sure that the visualization actually captured that. Like it showed this over a broader area. And so yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes to how you present it. And again, I think there isn't a perfect like answer to that. There's some tricks of the trade that you kind of figure out along the way. But I think it starts with kind of being thoughtful about it, I guess, and thinking about what can this data be used for, and what is it not good for, and how do we make sure that we're communicating that and how we publish it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I wasn't especially expecting like a full blown, oh, here's how we solve all the problems. I think we're all like struggling with those. I do want to, you were saying they bring the data. So when in the case of like the school mapping, for example, like you can have you guys are probably the ones fetching the satellite imagery to say here's how we have that. So but I'm guessing at first you had maybe like vector data that says here's like where the schools are. How does like that's being collected with like something specific in mind, and if it's not being for like remote sensing application, there's probably something that's being done there. So how do you make sure that you can actually get something out of that, and like, because if you're not controlling the way the data was gathered in the first place, as you said, there's probably a lot of work to be done. So could you maybe talk about how you guys handle that?
Yeah. I mean, it is handled by having a really great data team that is very thoughtful and creative, like understands the problem that we need to solve and figures out how we can improve, like what we're working with and how to improve it. And they spend a lot of time taking input data sets and then augmenting, using that. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll use that to get a first pass model that can at least give us some idea of where other examples might be, and use that to harvest other examples to then create a better data set. Like there are different approaches that we can use to augment the data set and get higher quality data. And then once you have a very high quality training data set, then you'll get better model results. And for them, that team is just so good at figuring out how to automate that work and be able to quickly pull together like a high quality training data set. So that's the part one of that. The part two is then how do we then, like the ML engineers themselves, take that and turn that into useful model data, right? How do they combine that with the satellite imagery data and make sure that it aligns? Which again, some of that is done on the data team side, but some of that is also how do we then automate and scale that? And so there's been a lot of work put into what are the data pipelines that we need in order to do that well. In places where good data sets already exist, how do we pull from OSM? Or how do we make sure that that's going to align nicely with the satellite imagery that we're pulling, or other places where some of this data might exist? And then in trying to abstract out as much of that as possible into the sort of open source tools that we're talking about, so that it isn't as much labor every time we need to do that. And so there are a number of tools that we've built for plugging into annotation data sets. And even our data team tends to, where possible, we put things into OSM or into an OSM-like database in order to provide the annotations. So we've invested a lot in the tooling around OSM as a way of automating and scaling the process of creating training data, but also doing inference. And then on the end side, once you have your predictions, Like sometimes you can just put your predictions out, but a lot of times your partner doesn't want to know where a computer vision algorithm thought there were roads. They just want to know where the roads are. And so then it goes back to the data team to clean that data. And so in many cases, essentially what the ML is doing isn't producing the answer. What the ML is doing is making our data and annotation team 30 times faster at mapping this than they would have been otherwise, right? Power infrastructure is one example of this. Like with the ML in there, the data team is able to map a country in a couple of days, whereas previously it would have taken months.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it depends on who the end user is and what we're talking about, but some combination of those three pieces are what we'll end up using. And honestly, you should talk to Nana or some of the other folks on the GeoAA team to really dig in on this. They can give you better ideas.
Yeah, I've been following some of them for a while, and I think there's probably a lot of really interesting stuff to gather there as well. So just to stay a little bit longer on that topic.
Sure.
So you have your problem. Someone comes to you with a problem, and they say, "Here, we have this data." And so you guys are probably the ones that say OSM is one source that we can take from. There's maybe this like optical satellite imagery that we can take from, or in case of the electrification, like there's this data set that we can go from. So how's that like process? How does that process happen, especially where there's a lot of like data you can buy as well. I'm thinking like planets. I've heard of this company called ISI. Just like, did you guys like have partnerships with that? Is it also like do you sometimes have a client that comes up and says, "Hey, we have this like label data, and we also we want you to use like our country's remote sensing satellite or something like that"?
Yeah. We haven't had, it needs to be our country's remote sensing satellite come on, but all that other stuff. Yeah, we this is coming back to what we were talking earlier about open. When does it need to be open, when not, right? Like if you can do it with open data, you probably should, but there are a lot of things you want to do that there just isn't open data for. You need better data, and in order for that better data to exist, there needs to be some sort of commercial model for somebody to go out and collect it and continue to provide it, right? And so we have great partnerships with a number of we love working with any satellite company, anybody who has great data we're huge fans of, and a lot of those groups we get to actually work with from time to time. And yeah, depending on what their need is, we'll help them understand what are the relative benefits of different sources of data that they might get. And so we like to stay on top of what's going on so that we can be making the best recommendations. We don't have a relationship with anybody where we get a cut. Like we don't have any kind of reseller agreement. So there's never an incentive for us to push them towards one provider or another. And I wouldn't want to be in a position where that was the case. Like we just give them like our read of the state of the industry and where they should get data from. So yeah, so we'll help walk them through that. And then occasionally we're plugged into everybody's APIs pretty well, where occasionally it makes more sense for us to just pull it, and then they pay us and we kind of pay the company on their behalf. The end goal for most of our projects is to give our partners tooling that they can sustainably run without us. And so then we can move on to the next problem and the next partner, the next project. And so that'll often involve getting them set up with a relationship with the partner that they need so that they can continue to access that data going forward. And in another year, when they need to run it again, they can figure that out. And also it's just easier for us from a billing standpoint if the credit card is on their side of things rather than us having to do that. So that's and sometimes a partner will come that already has a relationship with a satellite provider, or this also happens on the cloud infrastructure front. Like we have people that we're working with who are already on a particular cloud provider. So we have to make sure
Right.
that our tooling will work within that ecosystem. So yeah, like and in that case, all the better, right? Because then we can get to work as long as that data is gonna work for what their needs are.
Yeah, but I guess like then there's like also the infrastructure about like, as you're saying, you don't want to build something that runs on top of some data, but then the data stops coming at some point. So I'm
Yeah.
also guessing that's like something you need to keep in mind. Like Sentinel-2 is not going to run out tomorrow.
Right.
Unless something really bad happens, but
we've all had bigger problems.
Yeah, I think the whole field is probably screwed if that happens. But like that's probably something where beyond the it's free, it's like there's already a lot of infrastructure around that, and it's pretty easy to plug into that. I'm guessing
that's right. And look, and a lot of our partners have money, right? Like they have funds to pay for things, and so for some of the times it's not really that they have the ability to pay. Some of them are choosing to use open source, not just because they don't have to pay for it, but because of how they want to use the derived product and how they want other people to be able to use that. So some guys, it's important for them to be able to make the derived product open source, which some satellite providers are actually, commercial providers are actually have figured out a way for them to be able to do that and pay extra or pay to get a license that would allow them to do that. So sometimes that's workable in any event. But for some of these partners, it's more about how they want to use the data and what they want people to be able to do with it on the other end, not just whether or not they have to pay for it.
Fair enough. So you brought up Joe Morrison, and there's something that I want to ask you about. So you're on the receiving end of all these satellite providers, and you're like shopping for the best data. And so Joe mentions that one of the problems right now is that it's not commoditized. It's like really complicated to get some of the data. But now he works for one of those providers. So I'm really curious to ask you, like, who's on the other end of that, and who gets to pick and choose from all the whatever number of providers there are today. What's the important thing? Is that like really do you see that as an issue? I'm not saying Joe is wrong. I'm just asking what you see it like, because you're like having to see with all those providers, and you're basically the customer from all those providers.
Yeah. No, I think it's definitely an issue. I think it's an issue that people don't really feel the pain of yet because they haven't, the many of the sectors we work in haven't quite got to the art of what's possible, right? So even the work that we're doing, for a lot of organizations, we're kind of like looking at a point, they don't need streaming data, right? They're looking at a point in time. They want to know, knowing where the schools were 2 or 3 years ago is probably good enough for their purposes at the moment, right? And so because there are, and so in that case, then we can use Vivid or some other base map that's created that is accessible in a way that's different than the old kind of FTP based like ordering, going through a sale, all the stuff that Joe talks about, which is absolutely true. When we have to do that, it is exactly as much of a pain in the ass as Joe describes it to be. And so we try to find ways to avoid that. Well, the result of that is there are a ton of opportunities for this data to be used that it's not being used for, which is again the overall problem that we're trying to create. We're still at the point where we're getting people to be able to get as much value out of the things that are easy to use, that we haven't really invested in figuring out how to get them more value out of things that are really, really hard to use because there are human bottlenecks, not because of technical bottlenecks, which we have more control over, or process bottlenecks, which we don't have as much control over. But we are figuring it out, and actually it's been easier to figure it out where we have big partner clients that have a lot of stake in it. Right? We are working with NASA has a commercial small satellite program that purchases data from a number of small satellite providers that requires them to maintain that data in a different place than their standard data, which is fully open. This data is available to NASA PIs, but isn't distributed in the same way. And for that, they need an entirely different archive and search interface and request interface. And so we're working with them to build some of that out. And that allows us to interact with the satellite providers in ways that we're now representing that. Like NASA needs X in order to be able to do this, which gives us a bit more voice and leverage, I think, in some of those conversations on getting data to be distributed in ways that are going to be useful. And that's worked well. And I think that, like, as you see more demand, as you see more examples for how this could look, you'll see more demand for more streamlined forms of access, or more creative ways of packaging data, where it's not just I'm paying for a square kilometer or paying for scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that will kind of create a market that the sort of world that Joe wants to see, I think, will exist. I think the question is just how long does it take for us to get there? And I think he's right. Like the countervailing force is that the existence of a set of very sophisticated users in the defense and intelligence community that can do a lot of that stuff and have already built out their tooling for a current mode of doing things and are very happy with that status quo.
So you were mentioning at the very beginning when you were like presenting like development seed, like briefly, you were saying that you are trying to bridge the gap between the geospatial like data and then like solving those problems. Do you see that like your role changing if it gets like really easy to access a lot of the data?
Yeah, which would be great, right? Like, well, I think if yes, I think if it gets really easy to access the data, then our role is actually on the much more interesting side of this anyway, which is the interpretation and drawing insight from that data at scale still becomes a really interesting set of problems. And then how do you communicate that information to an end user in a way that allows them to make a better decision, right? Which isn't just dumping a bunch of data into a dashboard somewhere and expecting them to come and figure it out, but it's more closer to a weather app where you have a question and you need Earth data derived insights, and you hit a button and you have packaged for you the information that you need in order to decide what you're going to wear when you leave the house today, right? Like more data extraction and interpretation and packaging and publishing pipelines that look like a weather app. And that will all get easier to build on top of a better infrastructure that allows you to plug into data in real time as it comes off of satellites.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that sounds also like probably you're saying that the more interesting work.
For sure. Absolutely. And and ultimately, like, impactful, right? Like at the end of the day, if this data comes off a satellite and no one's looking at it, or like one person looks at it, there's so much latent value there that isn't being captured, right? And so
yeah, no, I mean, I agree definitely with that. Yeah, I also kind of wanted to ask about, everybody is like, there's been a very fun thing happening with this boat stuck in the Suez Canal, where every company was one-upping each other.
Yep.
So it makes for some very fun Twitter drama. It's not drama, but like Twitter story to follow. It's like our version of a TV show. What to you, to the problems that you guys are solving, what is the important stuff in the data? We keep hearing that, super high res is the stuff. Like it's also this like game of one-upping of like, we got 30 centimeters, we got 15 centimeters. Is that really what's important, or is it something else?
No, I mean, look, there are always going to be cases where having the clearest picture is going to be valuable, and depending on what you're looking for, you might need clearer and clearer, right? We have done work looking at encroachment on wildlife areas where we want to be able to uh, to identify specific wildlife, like
Yeah.
elephants versus lions, and versus cows versus domesticated wild animals as well. And that requires very high resolution imagery. And so for that, we actually used aerial imagery rather
Yeah.
than satellite imagery.
Yeah. I can imagine an elephant in Sentinel-2 doesn't look great.
Yeah, that would be a really impressive elephant. Um, so, so yeah, I mean, there will always be applications for which that is the case. I think my hope is that we are fundamentally moving to a different mode of getting value out of satellite imagery, where a lot of the value in the old world of satellite imagery, when there wasn't that much of it, and it was where it was there weren't very good tools for interpreting it, was that some human being had to look at that and make a determination about what was going on in that image. And for that, higher resolution is always going to be better, right? You're always going to get better signal for a human eye when they have a sharper image of what they're looking. For the most part, like higher resolution is always going to be better. You're going to be able to do more of that. I think what my hope is, and I think where we're going is, there's just so much data. There's more data than what human eyes can look at. Mm-hmm. We will need to be able to automate the process of extracting information from a thing, and from this data, in order to learn what's really going on around our planet and the timeliness that we need that information. And that might still involve getting human beings to look at some pieces of this. But that in that world, the resolution isn't necessarily the most important thing, right? Like temporal resolution might end up being more important, or the number of spectral bands that you have might be better information for a computer process to figure out what's going on, depending on what it is that they're trying to detect. Or the continuity of images within a certain area, right? Being able to have broader swaths, so that you can see what's going on over a wider area all at the same time, rather than trying to piece together. It would be hard to really get a full picture of the traffic of a city if you could only look at different pieces at different times of day, on different days, right? So there are different aspects that will become important as we become more sophisticated in our ways of processing and automating that. And for that, then higher resolution isn't necessarily the most important thing. It's been a while since I've looked at the research around this, but a few years ago, when we were looking into the research around road detection, it seemed like at some point higher resolution actually confuses a lot of the models that were
interesting
prominent at the time, right? Like 1 meter resolution was sort of the sweet spot, and if you got higher resolution data, you weren't necessarily getting better results. Now, the modeling approaches, this is 3 or 4 years ago, so modeling approaches have changed a lot since then. A lot of things have changed since then. And so that may not still hold, but there still may be times where you get very little or no benefit to a process by having higher resolution. And other things like temporal resolution or swath or band consistency, right, may end up being a lot more important. I think that's going to be a thing that ends up being huge as AI becomes applied to this more often, is how much can a computer assume that the pixel values in this image are comparable to the pixel values in this image, right? Human beings can kind of figure that out. If the atmospheric effects, they know they're looking at the same area, they can kind of, oh, this building is the same as this one. It looks a little weird today, but I can understand the same thing. But that's not always going to be the case for a computer. And so the having real analysis ready data where there is cross calibration between satellites and sensors, and where there's very good correction for atmospheric effects, so that a pixel is a pixel is a pixel, that's going to become an incredibly valuable asset, as much as resolution is for some applications.
Yeah, I saw you tweet I don't remember exactly when, but you put out a few points about what the future of satellite data could be, and data fusion was one of them. And there's been a lot of work again, I don't have a lot of the historical context, so maybe this is not new at all. But for example, merging Landsat and Sentinel together, is
Yep.
that what you meant by fusion data sets?
In that, yes. I mean, that was very specifically what that was referring to. Is there's a new data set that NASA put out. It's a great data set. It should be more widely known. It is a provisional data set at this moment, but it is a harmonized Landsat Sentinel.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new approach to harmonized Landsat Sentinel. They've done a lot of work on harmonization and atmospheric correction on both sides to get very well harmonized data. It is available now and worth kicking the tires on, because the goal, I think, is to scale that up. I don't think it's available. It's not available globally now. I don't remember the exact area that it covers, but I think the intent is to scale that up for the whole planet. And even I believe, I'm not speaking on behalf of NASA, but I believe that is also to then go through the archive and try to produce this
Right.
Going back as well. And that's just such a valuable data source. Now you're talking about, my understanding is the intent is to include the new Sentinel 2 missions as they go up,
Right.
C and D, and Landsat 9 when it goes up. And at that point, you're going to get to basically daily coverage in a daily comparable data, a daily data set that is fully open. And, at 30-meter resolution, right? So there's certain applications that's super suitable for, and others that it isn't. But that's incredibly valuable. That's an incredibly valuable land coverage data set. And so I do think you're going to see more of that sort of data fusion, where you have fusion from different sensors in order to get better temporal coverage, but also where you have fusion of different sensors that are providing different pieces of a picture, so you can basically have a package that is calibrated in a way that you can expect a relationship between those pieces of the picture, right? Like and that might be sea surface temperature and current speed, right? Like those things might be collected from different sources, but they've been calibrated in a way that you can expect that there's a correlation between the times, and there's like accuracy that a difference that over time is an actual difference in the world and not a difference in the data, right? That the way the data was prepared. And that, I think, will unlock a lot of really great science.
So maybe this is a world I'm not super familiar with, but this sounds to me like a lot of the weather and meteorological data sets that are out there, which you get like the wind measurements. And it's not a direct measurement. It's like multiple observations that have been aggregated, put through a model, and then it says, here's like the U component of the wind, like everywhere in the world, 6 hours. Yeah. Do you think that's where we're heading for things like optical imagery?
For things like optical imagery, yeah. I mean, I think like you'll first get it in other sorts of phenomenon, right? Like you'll get modeled, like this already happens with ocean currents, where it's basically a combination of satellite-derived data and buoy data and other things, and that will get better and more accurate. You'll get this for soil moisture, which would include some optically derived data, but also thermal and other bands of data or other sources of data, including probably some ground in situ data. Probably more in optical, probably more on the non-visible spectrum side of the world, where you get like, you'll get a global vegetation index or something along those lines, or something. I do think that there will be applications where that becomes where that is valuable, and where you have the data coverage necessary to provide something that is novel and useful.
So it's more maybe around like the beginning of an analysis already, rather than like this raw pixel of like, this is the the band of like RGB in Sentinel-2, but in NDVI is like already trying to start an analysis rather
Yep.
than a pure measurement.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Um, I do want to come back to how do you like moving a little bit away from like the pure engineering and the data and going to like zooming out a little bit and seeing like what you guys are trying to do. It looks like you guys have a lot of different partners and work with many people. How does that happen? How do you decide
Mm.
who you work with?
So every potential project, a lot of the projects that come our way are people who come to us.
Okay.
We have the benefit of a lot of requests. And I think that's partly because we're so open and verbose
Okay.
about what we do, which we should always do more. But a lot of stuff comes into us. Every opportunity that comes our way starts as a ticket in a repo that's available to all team members. We have a few kind of recognized criteria on which we're evaluating those opportunities. Things like mission fit, and is this an organization that we believe in what they're trying to accomplish? Is this a technical area that we have something to contribute? Is this an area where we have something that can learn? Is there ability for us to do additional open source work or R&D work on the back of this? Things along those lines are things that make it more. Is it an issue area that is particularly compelling to members of our team?
Okay.
Like all of those are kind of the loose criteria. Like, is this a partner that would be good to work with in terms of just them being able to, are they able to make decisions in a timeline that you can actually work with them? Are they able to, are they just good people and
Okay.
are they curious people? And, is this somebody who's going to create a contract and hold us to it, even though the world has changed? Or is this somebody that actually wants to build the best thing in the moment, and we can actually work with them along the way to get them to a point that they are most likely to be successful? All that stuff. But then, yeah, it is a conversation, and some of it depends on how much work we have at that given time, what we can take on. And I'll tell you, there are just so many times where we're like basically strapped, and there's somebody that comes in. It's like, oh, this is such a good opportunity, and so we often find a way to make it happen because we really are passionate about the work, or we're passionate about some of the spin-off benefits of the tech we're going to be able to create, or it's a group that we've always wanted to work with, and now we finally have a chance. But that's generally how it works. Is it's pretty, we figure it out as we go along. But
it's a pretty nice situation to be in.
It is, yeah. It is a good situation to be in. Yes, I think we've been deliberate about maintaining a team size that's smaller than the amount of good work to do deliberately, so that we never find ourselves in a position where we have to take on not very compelling work.
Okay, right.
Because you don't keep amazing people when you have to start giving them shit work, honestly. And so we are often on that other side of things, where there's more good stuff out there to do than there are people on the team to do it.
Right, I see.
Which is, yeah.
And that's actually something I wanted to ask, but I think we've touched upon, is like how did you put like a team like that together? Because you were saying 45 people. That's starting to be quite a lot of people.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think anybody who is in the enviable position of having a really great team would be lying if they didn't say there was some luck involved in the beginning. I think we got some really great people early on. We got some great projects early on, and those things just fed each other really well, right? We had interesting projects and great people, which brought in more interesting projects, which allowed us to have great work to talk about and to do the open source work on the side. So it's like this loop of interesting projects, good people bring interesting projects, but the like the lubrication for that engine is comms and talking about it. Like that doesn't work if you're not talking about the things that you're doing, if you're not
Right.
putting things out in the world in a way that is actually helpful, that people want to carry that message and not just bragging about yourself.
Fair enough.
And so, yeah, that's been how it's worked so far. And yeah, and I think like one of the other things also that is that we have, like our approach to how we solve the problem has allowed us to attract a team that is very diverse in a lot of ways, right? And
Okay.
including a diversity of background. Like we do have some people that are very deep in the geospatial scene, right? People like Ben Sarago, who's been building out the COG framework, who's been doing this forever and comes from Mapbox, or Nana, who has a PhD in machine learning and particularly an application to satellite imagery. But then we have other people, Amy Bertescus, who came from a company where she was Nava, which was doing more work around healthcare in the US, like healthcare.gov and other things around providing government services, or Drew, who actually came from a bank. All right. So we have these people who have very different perspectives. And it's just like a great scene. Like I think a number of other geospatial services shops end up having a ton of people who all graduated from the same 2 or 3 programs devoted to a particular monolithic software package. And that is exciting a place to work, right? And so that doesn't attract. And so I think some of it has been our interest and willingness to find people who are outside of the typical mold, but actually bring a lot of value into the sector.
Talking about that, can you tell me how Development Seed started? Like,
oh yeah,
I'd be really curious to hear that story.
Yeah, so it's me too. So I wasn't here for it. Development Seed was started in 2003 by a group of Americans who were all in Ayacucho, Peru during grad school. Eric Gunderson, Bonnie Bogle, and Ian Ward. And originally they were just building open source tools to help NGOs and governments get online, right? Back when in 2003 and 2004, it was hard to do that. And it was huge in Drupal community and building out open source tooling for building places for people to connect before Facebook existed and this other stuff. Got really big into open data and doing a lot of work around open data of all sorts, from helping the Department of Education publish school data better, to working with the World Bank on their their big open data site and initiative at the time. And then I was working with Development Seed as a client on some work in Afghanistan around Afghanistan elections. We knew that there were irregularities in the Afghanistan elections in 2009. There were definitely some shenanigans, but it was unclear the extent of those shenanigans and the degree to which they influenced the impact of the election. And so the group I was working with at the time, National Democratic Institute, worked with Development Seed to pull down the Election Commission's own results data, parse out this 4,000 page PDF, like scanned data PDF in, I think there was an English version, but and turn it into a map that showed what happened, and to overlay that information with ethnicity data, to overlay it with population data, and to really start to get a picture of, oh yeah, there was a lot of shenanigans, and it basically all supported one candidate. And it was from, I am told by other people who were in these rooms, it was that data was, that map, that picture was really important for the international community to determine that they did not support the outcome of that election and that a runoff would be required, even though the election itself said that Karzai had won outright and didn't need a runoff. There was a rejection of that outcome, and a runoff ended up being held. And so for me, it was a great example of seeing how mapping data and putting data in like data becomes the glue. Geography becomes the glue to combine a bunch of different disparate data sets to be able to get a good picture of what's actually going on the ground. And so that was a really good takeaway for me. And then for Eric and Bonnie and that crew, that ended up being the beginning of creating Mapbox, what would become Mapbox. It was really hard at that point to put that data
Okay.
on a website. So they built a set of tools that would grow and become Mapbox. And eventually, several years later, Mapbox wasn't just being used in their own work, but Financial Times was using it, Pinterest was using it. And so they spun that out into a separate company. I came in and took over Development Seed in 2013
Okay.
when they spun out Mapbox to continue it along that initial mission of using data and tech to solve like hard social and environmental problems. And I can continue in that way.
So yeah, that's like, I did not expect it to like go that way, that far back. But that's why I'm happy to have those conversations, because I probably wouldn't have known otherwise. And so you were saying that I'm trying to understand like your path as well as an individual. Like, did I understand correctly? Did you say like that was the moment where like geospatial made sense, or were you working in geospatial before that?
I had done stuff in geospatial before that, right? We did some work mapping polling stations in the first geospatial project I did was in the Palestinian territories in 2005, 2006, mapping polling stations. And there was really important, even though there were only 1,000 polling stations, there are so many restrictions on movement that you might be 100 yards from a polling station, but it takes you forever to get there because of the blockades, checkpoints along the way. And so it was hard for people to know where to go to vote. And it was hard for even the election commission to know who could vote in a place, who would actually have access to a place if we put it here. And so that was some of the work that was some of the first mapping work that I was doing back in those days. But this was sort of a different level of realization of the value of combining different data sets and the way that you can create understanding on the canvas that is geography, right? Was a really big realization for me in 2009 that I hadn't really seen previously in the same way. And I think, again, 2009, it was really hard to provide geographic data on the web in an interactive way that people can like interrogate it and start to draw their own conclusions from it. And there were some things that we got wrong, definitely, in how we did that, but there were enough pieces that showed what might be possible that I think it was exciting for me personally, and certainly it was exciting for Eric and the team, and that they kind of dropped a lot of their other work and started investing much more in developing out the Mapbox stack.
Can I ask what you were doing like before that?
So, so I've always been kind of flirting with this interface between humans and technology. It's where a lot of the really fun problems are. And so my first job out of college was on more of the tech side, helping support language instruction software. And then I left that as a young, wide-eyed idealist to come down to Washington, D.C. and work with an NGO that was promoting democracy and human rights, and quickly became like the guy in that organization who understood technology and helped build out the technology as a programming area, which involved all sorts of fun work, from using encoded SMS messages to monitor elections, through to these sorts of mapping efforts, wide-scale mapping efforts. I did that for a decade. I did that until 2010, then 2011, then bounced to the State Department to build the program. Under Hillary Clinton's State Department, there was a large emphasis on internet freedom and making sure that the internet itself was a place that protected people's rights to freedom of information, association, and assembly. And would build out the programming piece of work that the State Department would support in order to make that more of reality. So everything from training, like digital security training for journalists and activists, through to supporting technologies like Tor and other tools that actually give people this access in places that are otherwise being blocked. And then left that in 2013 and was starting to figure out how to pull together a group of people to work on tech and human rights issues when Eric called and said, "Hey, I got this thing. Do you want to take over Development Seed?" Which is a group that I always respected and was yeah, didn't have to think about it very much.
Okay, so you were doing something else, and then you got pulled to Development Seed and jumped on that in 2013.
Yeah, and have spent the last 8 years learning how to run this organization. It's been a wild ride.
So that's also something that I wanted to ask you is like, it seems that you were very driven by the impact of what you're building. So how can you build a company around something like that? Because in my very naive model of the world, it's like there's two things. There are like NGOs and non-NGOs, basically like for-profit. So one of the things that I'm really interested is in companies like Signal, who are trying to build something,
Yep.
and they're saying we're not for profit, we're for something else. So
yep.
in geospatial, that's also something that I believe is quite important because of the impact. So how do you do something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me kind of spitball along the way, right? I think one
Sure,
of the things
please,
that I've learned is that there's not as much space, there's not as much of a gap as you might expect between NGO and for-profit organizations, right? At the end of the day, those entities have incentives and they're maximizing around those incentives. And well, a for-profit might cast that more in terms of shareholders and returning profit to shareholders and hitting certain like milestones that are related to growth of the company and the footprint of the company and making it a bigger, more prestigious, higher market cap, whatever you want to call it, capturing more of the market. NGOs actually act in somewhat similar ways, right? At the end of the day, they believe that they're not all, let me say, like a lot of the NGOs that I interact with in DC, let me be more clear, that I work with, particularly in DC, are part of this development industrial complex where they've equated their existence with the outcome that they're driving for, equated their existence towards the outcome, right? Like we are here to feed children, and if we didn't exist, all the children would starve, and so we must continue to exist. And so a lot of their decision making is somewhat similar, sort of perpetuating the organization, and making sure that to expand their footprint. And you see when you're in these organizations that they justify a lot of kind of, well, we know we're not doing great work in that country, or that country director is kind of a jerk, but we don't want to have to close the office because all these and so they end up operating in ways that are, at the end of the day, if you're running an NGO of 150 people, you also don't want to fire people, right? So you're going to continue to make decisions because you're probably a good, kind, warm-hearted person and you feel this loyalty to your staff. So you're going to continue to make decisions that grow the organization rather than allowing the organization to contract. And at the end of the day, they act in somewhat similar ways. I think the key difference, whether you're an NGO or for-profit or whatever, is to get that incentive structure right. Why are you doing, what is pushing you towards the place that you're trying to go? And I think Signal has done it nicely. I think there are a lot of things that make it hard to do this. And then there are some that make it possible. It's really hard to do this when you're a VC-backed firm where some people are expecting to make 10x or more multiples on the investment that they gave, right? It's hard. You have this set of people who are ultimately you can't override, that have a set of expectations that isn't aligned necessarily with impact as much as they might talk about it. It's really hard to do this when you're a publicly traded company, although you can have impact, positive impact. And if you're the right person in the right organization of a huge company, there's a lot of good that you can do in the world. But ultimately, you can't be an impact-driven company when you are when you have lawyers that tell you you're legally obliged to protect the value of shareholders above all other things. You can try to couch the impact related things that you want to do in terms of that will make those lawyers happier, but ultimately that's who you're going to be. It's really hard to do this when you're a entity that is competing for funding in order to be able to competing for like short-term funding, especially in order to be able to continue to exist as an organization. It's hard to really set yourself up to put impact first when you're constantly sort of struggling to keep the organization going. So there's a lot of ways that are hard. I think the sort of secret sauce, the elements that make it easier are one, either whoever controls the organization ultimately needs to be bought in that this is why we exist. And so for Signal, because Moxie is like, look, this is just what we're doing, that gets to work, right? Like that box is checked, right? Whoever ultimately decides how the organization operates needs to be fully bought in that this is why we are who we are. And then you kind of need, the nice thing about what Moxie's developed, and I think we're trying to do the same thing, is like we can create enough value, we can find enough things that are valuable and aligned with that impact that people are willing to pay us for,
Right.
that we can sustain ourselves as an organization and actually make profit, make an overhead on that allows us to then funnel that into the things that people won't pay us for that we think they should, but they don't see it yet, or maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't. We have to go figure it out if that's worth investing in, or whatever, right? So we aren't spending a lot of time on fundraising. We have the funds to do things, and then if they take off, then we can grow them into programming. And that's essentially the DevSeeds model. We are legally organized as a for-profit. We operate as a nonprofit. Any profits that we make on our contracts are reinvested back into the team and the work that we do, and in the open source work and R&D work that we do. So we have this, and that allows us to pursue this impact-driven mission that would be hard to do under other models.
So is it like because you work with all these partners and you're able to sustain yourselves, basically that allows you to follow that model?
Yeah. And actually, I mean, I think the partners are just as important to it, right? Like, I think the partners are what we play one very small role in the act of making change. Like, we take data and make it more and help get it into a format where it can be used for something else. But somebody else is probably collecting that data, and somebody else is probably applying that data. And so it only works where we have really good partners on probably both sides of that. And it is through our partners that we get a chance to have that full impact, but it's also through working with our partners that we can see pain points that would be really hard to see if we were just sort of a VC-backed firm working against a problem that's still pre-revenue, doesn't have any customers yet, and is just sort of a bunch of engineers in a room trying to figure out what they think is going to be the thing that's going to save the world, right? Like, we actually have to solve real problems for real people, and that teaches us a lot about where the real pain points really are.
So do you feel like a sort of pressure then in like, if you're the one that says, because you're the one that, you know, has those three magical letters, CEO, about like, and you're saying, you know, that's the person that has to be fully on board about what the mission is. And that's probably something where, how do you make sure you keep on track?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I haven't done a good job, honestly, of getting to yet. But I think you need to find ways to bake that in so it isn't just your decision. I think that makes sense. I don't know how Moxie's done that. I should talk to Moxie.
I think they're in a way where they can't get bought, for example. So there's like, they're like, one of the things that was really interesting is how they're exactly trying to bake a system where even if, like, of all the cogs, he's the one that fails, the whole system doesn't break down. That's
right. No, and I think that's what you have to do. And to be fair, like, I haven't done that yet, right? Like that is work to be done, I think, for development seed, and I think we'll be a better and stronger organization for having done it.
And I'm just like, it's out of curiosity. How do you think something like that is possible to bake it in the system?
I don't. I do have to do more research on it. I mean, I do think I have more ideas that probably won't work than ones that I'm sure will. I should really investigate what Moxie's framework is. I think there is probably some way that so what we've done so far is we have like a sense of what it means to be DevSeed, and I see myself as a steward of that, as much as anything, right? And that even is like our culture and way of doing things. There was a lot about that I had to learn when I took it over. There were things that weren't natural to me, and so some of it is really defining who you are and allowing anybody in the organization to keep anybody else accountable to that vision, including myself and especially myself. So that is like necessary, probably not sufficient. But then I think you probably do need some sort of actual legal structures that provide for that. And yeah, it might be things like a contract that it's about not being bought, or the circumstances under which a major change in the organization might happen, and what that would have to complete in order for it to be considered an improvement, like moving in the direction of that the organization wants to go, and or not. You probably have at least some set of team members, if not the entire team, that's empowered, like through some actual mechanisms, to keep the team working towards that vision, and also to be able to update that vision as appropriate, because the world changed, as you don't want to be stuck in a thing that doesn't make sense anymore. But to be able to do that with the right intent in mind, where it's not being driven, where it is in nobody's individual benefit to, like, nobody gets to like cash out as a result of that, right?
Yeah.
People like it is in a way that is in the benefit of the overall goals and mission and what you're trying to accomplish and impact you're trying to have. So yeah, I'm not the best person to talk to on that, but yeah, it is a thing that I will be very keen to listen to the podcast you do with somebody that has figured this out.
Well, if Moxie ever starts doing maps, I'll try to talk to him.
Yeah. Man, if Moxie ever starts doing maps, I'm in. Whatever he's building, I'm in.
Yeah, Moxie, if you're listening, start doing maps. No, they probably have a lot of stuff, because I know they had some troubles getting it in some countries, and they probably have a lot of geopolitical issues at hand that I'll try to find a way to talk to him about.
There you go.
But yeah, it's really interesting, because I work with computers, and so it feels like in machine learning we have this very convenient thing, which is called the loss function and metrics, which is like, whatever it takes, you optimize this number. And so it's like, how do you make that but for impact? Not necessarily having like an answer. It's just like my thought right now there, but it's something that's really interesting to think about, is how do you build a system where the incentive is like measurable? Because from what I understand right now, the incentive isn't like something that you can measure. It's like you as a team, as a company, getting together and seeing, this is something we want to do because it's important. You can't measure it. You can't say, this is something good to work on and this isn't. But I think it's something where maybe if we manage to find a way to put that, then it's like, oh, you don't need to be for profit. You can be for this metric. And maybe it allows this system to grow to other fields.
Yeah. Hey, another person to talk to beyond Moxie, I recall Jed Sundwall, who is AWS and built the Earth on AWS project there, be very appropriate for this podcast. And I know that that is also an area that he has personally done a lot of thought and research, is how do you build organizations, like impact-driven organizations. And so he might be a good person to approach with that as well.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I'll definitely look it up.
I would listen to any podcast that Jed's talking about as well. He's a great guy. Super smart.
All right. You were talking about, I think you said something really interesting about how do you stay relevant in, change. And so that's a great segue to say, the world's changed a lot in the past year. How have you guys handled that? Talking about COVID for people listening in 20 years.
Yeah, for sure. So there are a bunch of different pieces of that. One is, how do we continue to work as an organization? On that, we were in pretty good shape to begin with. When COVID hit, we already had more remote team members than office-based team members. So we were already, and many of our teams span time zones, including everything from Bangalore to Seattle, right? So we were doing a lot async. We also have a culture that is very, and a way of working that is very protective of people's time and attention in order to give them space to crank. And that involves a lot of asynchronous communication.
Okay.
So we were already really well set up on our project work for people to plug in. And a lot of people had already created a space and were already set up to be doing remote work well. So that mostly worked. I think we still found there are people who had kids whose childcare shut down, or people who were in offices that weren't as well set up for it. And so we did everything we could to work with them and help figure out how to get scheduling right, or get them set up with equipment they might need. And that was really our operations team who spent a lot of time focused on that and getting everybody where they need to be. So that worked as well as could be expected. I think we had fewer growing pains than a lot of organizations that weren't used to that. And I'd be curious what a group that was doing a lot of defense-related work, where they required everybody to be in secure buildings, like how they were able to navigate that. I imagine they had a lot more growing pains. And then there was the client work side of it, and that was sort of a mixed bag. We did have some projects that we lost. Not too many, but we did have some notable projects that we lost because they were working with partners where their priorities changed and what we were working on was no longer going to make sense for them, or no longer their top priority. But then we had as many projects that we ended up have partners that needed more work as a result, right? So Red Cross, for instance, we were doing work with the Red Cross on a platform that they use to collect data about for disaster response from, so we were working with the International Federation of the Red Cross, IFRC, and they received requests from country chapters, from individual country chapters, and they have a platform they use to be able to understand the situation of different disasters in different countries. And that was built anticipating an earthquake in Chile, like a thing in one place. It was not built anticipating, the whole world's on fire and we need to really be able to track this event that's happening all over the place. So they needed a lot of work, a lot of help figuring out how to build out their tooling and infrastructure to be able to handle a different sort of disaster than they'd been prepared for. And so we had to spin up a lot of work in this, particularly in this first couple of months, to support partners that were facing different sorts of data challenges than they were used to. Or who wanted to be able to help in some way. NASA wanted to was creating a number of COVID-related data sets and wanted to be able to publish that data. So it ended up being a nuts couple of months. We continued to grow the organization through that time. We found ways to hire and onboard people remotely. Man, I'm really looking forward to the first time I get to meet a lot of these people in person. I'm very excited for face-to-face meetings to be a thing again, hopefully soon. But yeah, I think all in all, it was absolutely a tough year for everybody, personally and individually. But as an organization, we did all right.
And so you say that, first of all, that's like pretty nice to hear. I'm glad you guys are making it work. And I just want to ask, so you said you have a like part of the team that's remote and part of the team that's with you in DC. How do you make that work?
Yeah, so we actually have three offices. We have DC,
Okay,
Lisbon, and Ayacucho. So already having multiple offices
right.
requires you to communicate in different ways than you would if you had everybody all in one place. Um, I think we make that work pretty well, and a lot of it is just like being in GitHub a lot, right? Like we have repos and very good communicate. We're screening for people who are good communicators. We're helping people communicate well around project work. All of our other important processes are run out of a repo, right? We have a repo for recruiting. We have a repo for business
Okay,
development and new
wow, that's interesting.
opportunities. We have a repo for operations needs, and everybody at the organization has access to all of those repos.
Okay,
So there's a lot of transparent decision making. It's not like everybody has a vote in everything, or we would never get
yeah,
anything done, particularly as a 40-person organization.
I bet.
But if there are things that you care about or things you think you can add value on around a thing that we're looking at in any area, you have the ability to do that. And it's easy to plug people in as we need more help on something, right? If we need more people in recruiting, they have the history of all the conversations we've had so far. If we need more people to help
Right,
people to help with a
right.
proposal, they have the full thread, access to the full thread, and other examples of other work that we've done and all that as well. So that's worked well for us. Yeah, and then just trying to like my job, which is trying to connect dots, provide context, make sure that people are have the information that they need or being proactively given the information they need to work well and make good decisions. Um, Trying to do that best I can, and sometimes that works well, and sometimes there are things I can get better at. But yeah, that's basically how we made it work.
Yeah, I can imagine with like, I don't know at the pace you guys have been growing. I don't know how many people you were when you joined.
Three.
Right. So I can imagine that's also changed a lot about how you have to work. Like,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, every time. I mean, and that's kind of the challenge and also the fun thing of running a small organization that's growing is as soon as you figure out how to run a 6-person organization, suddenly you're a 10-person organization with 2 offices, and you need to figure out how to do that. Um, so yeah, I've been extremely fortunate along the way to have other founders and other people who are running companies in the sector who've been extremely generous with their time and what they've learned. Particularly that initial DevSeed crew, like Eric and Bonnie and that group have been great, and extremely generous with their time and making sure that I have what I need, like in helping me to help this team be successful. But also, yeah, people like Joe um, Robert at Xavier or Craig at Visuality and other people who are in the same sector. Will at Spark Geo, like these are just good people who are also struggling and want and are happy to like talk things through and help us figure things out.
yeah, I've like maybe like a few people in the industry. I kind of stumbled upon this by accident, about this geospatial world, and I'm like amazed at how um, like people communicate from different places, and just yeah, it's really nice to see how open people are, and how nice, like even though we're all in the same industry, and it could be really, um, it could be really close, and people like not talking to each other and everything, and then trying to step on each other, but it's really not, at least it doesn't come like that, after spending a bit in it, and it's really nice
Um,
to see that.
I think that's right. I think that like at the end of the day, the people who are in this sector want to solve problems, and that's what motivates them. They're here because they care about the planet and they are curious about it, and want to learn things about it, and ultimately, like, engineers want to solve a problem, and so I think that that engineer mindset really plays itself out. I think particularly with some of the groups that are more open source type shops, maybe maybe less so with some of the few that are less so. But yeah, I mean, I found that across the satellite companies that we work with. I found that across the services companies that we sometimes partner with and sometimes compete with. Um, yeah, and among the many of the um, like the people who are running geospatial shops within larger organizations as well.
Yeah.
So it is great. It's a good community to be part of.
I see the, like, at my little tiny scale of a guy who's been in this for like no more than a couple of years. I've seen the industry start changing. You were mentioning about how you guys work on cogs a lot, for example. Like there's a bit of a, it seems like, at least there's a bit of a shift about how the data is accessed and how we manipulate it from even like a
Yep,
few years ago.
for
How
sure.
do you see that, like, without, we talked about those the like new data sets and things like that. I just want to kind of end on something like that. Like, how do you see that going in the next few years? And do you think, like, yeah, just how do you see that moving forward?
Yeah. The for me, it's like putting data into pockets, moving from pixels to pockets, right? Like, there are not enough, even for as big as our sector is, there are not enough geospatial engineers and analysts to be able to, if every decision that needs to be made requires work from an individual,
Right.
then most of the decisions that could benefit from this data won't use it, right? There's just like not enough for that sort of one-to-one relationship of, I'm going to task my GIS unit to create a map for me, and then they're going to give me a thing, and I'm going to make decisions based on that. So we have to take that geospatial understanding and knowledge and research and abstract it out in some way that it can be applied repeatedly on new data as it comes in, and scale, right? And that requires us to move to new models of data collection, access, storage, distribution, processing, which is largely going to happen on the cloud, right? The cloud is great because it allows you the scale to operate, but it's also great because anybody can plug into it, and you can have people who are spinning up their applications right next to it, and you can build an app right next to it, that these data sets that allows you that sort of access. If the cloud's going to work, then we need new ways of organizing data to take advantage of that. And you can't just take everything that was developed, the file formats and distribution formats, and this is sort of like the origin of some of the things that Joe complains about. You can't take all of these ways that used to work in a non-cloud world and just put those same things on the cloud. You're not going to have achieved that outcome. And so finding cloud optimized ways to store and manage and distribute and analyze data is the challenge that we have right now, that will unlock that future where I can just pull up an app and get access to the geospatial information and data that will allow me to make a better decision. Whether I'm a firefighter trying to figure out where the fire is going to go next, or whether I'm a farmer in rural Ethiopia trying to figure out what I should be doing with this crop, or whatever that is. And so COG, which stands for Cloud Optimized GeoTIFF, is
should have
one.
said that. Sorry.
No, it's cool. Is one important piece of that puzzle for figuring out how we can organize data in a way that unlocks all of these different modes of usage that aren't possible when we have Sentinel size files locked into like huge, like 2 gig, zip files or whatever, right? Like, or Landsat scenes that are all in one big zip file, right? That doesn't allow you to the level of access that you need in order to be able to power all these things.
So do you see that as like a technological challenge, or do you see any other challenges of like making that. I really like what you're saying of like the pixel to the pocket. Like, do you see that as a technical challenge, or is it like something else?
It's a lot. I mean, there are technical challenges associated with that. Yeah, many of the most interesting challenges are people challenges.
Right.
So some of it is going to end up being like data licensing things and
Yeah.
how data providers provide information. Some of it is going to be like there's this really neat opportunity for. So one of the projects we're working on with NASA is to build a tool for to empower people who do biomass estimation.
Okay.
NISAR, the ESA biomass mission, and JEDI are these great data sets that will be useful. They're all coming online that will be useful for biomass estimation, but they're huge. And the old model of downloading it to my computer and trying it just is broken. So we're working with NASA and JPL and a few others and ESA on building a platform that allows biomass researchers to actually take their analysis to the cloud and do that analysis there. And that's cool. That is a great way of solving a problem. The really neat thing for me that opens up is it opens up opportunities for collaborative research that wouldn't have been possible previously, where if I was going to do this sort of research, I could only do it on my own university's supercomputing cluster, and I could only do it with researchers that happen to be like at the same institution as me. But now you have this shared space that you can have one person at University of Maryland and somebody at University of Barcelona and somebody like wherever else, like researchers all over the world who are collaborating on a thing, and you're able to reproduce each other's research, and it creates an opportunity that wouldn't have existed under the old technology. But in order for that to actually be realized at scale, you also need to change the incentives, the way that research is funded.
Yeah.
You need to change a lot of the human structures that are reinforcing the current modes and incentives or disincentives around that sort of collaboration. And so, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of those sorts of structures are going to need to be challenged in order for us to get to that outcome that we're hoping for.
It sounds like a great way to end this.
All right.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the time. This was amazing. I think we talked for a long while. Thanks a lot for this. This was really nice. I really appreciate you wasting some time with me talking about this.
Yeah, likewise, man. I hope your other conversations are better. Maxime, thanks so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.